The kingdom of Israel had never seen days as dark as these. King Ahab sat on the throne, but he had abandoned the God of his fathers. He had married Jezebel, a foreign princess from Sidon, who brought with her the worship of Baal and Asherah. Across the land, altars to false gods multiplied like weeds. The prophets of the Lord were being hunted down and killed. The sacred places where people once worshipped the true God were now filled with idols and priests who served demons. It seemed as though the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been forgotten in his own nation. The people of Israel had seen their fathers perform miracles. They had heard stories of how God brought them out of Egypt, parted the Red Sea, and gave them this promised land. But now, those stories felt like distant legends. The current generation was more interested in following the practices of their pagan neighbors than honoring the covenant their ancestors had made with the Lord. King Ahab himself was weak. He allowed his wife Jezebel to control the spiritual direction of the nation. She wasn't content with simply worshipping her own gods privately. She wanted to eliminate the worship of the Lord completely. She established hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah, funding them from the royal treasury. She built temples and high places throughout the land, and most terrifying of all, she began a systematic execution of anyone who prophesied in the name of the God of Israel. The faithful remnant in Israel felt abandoned. Where was God? Why wasn't he defending his own name? The false prophets were everywhere, performing their rituals, making their proclamations, and leading the people further into darkness. It seemed like evil had won. Then, without warning, a man appeared before the king. His name was Elijah, and he came from Tishbe in Gilead, a remote region east of the Jordan River. No one had heard of him before. He held no official position in the royal court. He commanded no army and carried no royal credentials. He wasn't a well-known prophet with a school of disciples. He was simply a man who knew his God and refused to be silent. He walked into the presence of the most powerful man in Israel and spoke. There was no introduction, no diplomatic pleasantries, no careful negotiation. The words that came from his mouth were not a request or a suggestion. They were a declaration of war against the entire religious system that Ahab and Jezebel had built. As recorded in the opening verse of 1 Kings chapter 17, Elijah said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." Think about the weight of that moment. Elijah was standing before a king who had the power to execute him on the spot. He was challenging the entire religious system that controlled the nation. Baal was worshipped as the god of storms, the one who supposedly controlled rain and fertility. The prophets of Baal claimed that their god was the one who brought the rains that made crops grow and animals thrive. The entire agricultural economy of Israel depended on seasonal rains, and Baal was credited with providing them. By declaring a drought, Elijah was directly confronting Baal's authority. He was saying that the God of Israel, not Baal, controlled the heavens. He was announcing that the sky would close and the rain would stop, and it would happen because the God of Israel commanded it. More than that, Elijah declared that the rain would not return except at his word. He was claiming authority over the weather itself. This wasn't just a prediction about a natural disaster. This was a theological challenge. This was one prophet of the Lord standing against hundreds of prophets of Baal and saying, "Let's see whose God is real." This was Elijah drawing a line in the sand and daring the entire nation to choose sides. The prophet didn't ask for permission. He didn't debate or negotiate. He didn't try to convince Ahab with arguments or miracles. He simply announced what would happen, and then, as Scripture shows us, he left. There was no discussion, no opportunity for the king to respond or threaten or bargain. Elijah delivered his message and disappeared. Ahab was left standing there with a promise that would reshape the entire nation. The sky would close, the ground would harden, the crops would fail, the animals would die, and it would all happen because one man had spoken in the name of the living God. The king, who had thought himself powerful, suddenly realized that there was a power far greater than his throne, and that power had just declared judgment on his kingdom. After delivering his message to the king, Elijah needed to leave quickly. Jezebel would soon hear about what he had said, and her response would be deadly. She had already killed many prophets of the Lord, and she wouldn't hesitate to add Elijah to that list. The man who had just humiliated her religious system and threatened the economic stability of the nation would become her primary target. But Elijah didn't run in panic. He didn't flee to a foreign country or hide in a random cave hoping not to be found. He went exactly where God told him to go. This is one of the most important details in Elijah's story. He wasn't making decisions based on fear or strategy. He was listening for God's voice and obeying what he heard. The word of the Lord came to him with clear instructions, as we read in 1 Kings 17 verses 2 through 4. "Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Chariot ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." Elijah obeyed immediately. He left the populated areas of Israel and traveled east, crossing the Jordan River back into the wilderness region where he had come from. The Chariot ravine was a hidden place, a narrow gorge carved by a small stream over thousands of years. It was the kind of location where a man could disappear completely. The ravine had steep walls, dense vegetation, and few access points. No soldiers would find him there. No spies would report his location. It was the perfect hiding place, but there was a significant problem. How would he survive? The ravine was isolated, far from any town or settlement. There were no markets where he could buy food, no farms where he could work for meals, no communities where he could find shelter. And remember the context. Elijah himself had just announced a drought. Soon there would be no food anywhere in the land. The crops would fail. The stored grain would run out, and people would begin to starve. How could one man survive alone in a wilderness ravine during a famine? God had already thought of that. He had arranged something that seemed impossible, something that defied all natural explanation. The scripture continues in verses 5 and 6, telling us that Elijah did what the Lord had told him and went to the Chariot ravine, where he camped by the brook. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Ravens, wild birds that normally scavenge and steal, birds that were considered unclean according to the law of Moses, and were not supposed to be touched or eaten by God's people. Yet these were the creatures God chose to feed his prophet. Every morning and every evening they came like clockwork, carrying food in their beaks. Where did they get the bread and meat? The Bible doesn't say. It only tells us that they brought it, and Elijah ate. Perhaps they took it from the king's table. Perhaps God simply created it. The text doesn't explain the source, because the source wasn't the point. The point was that God was providing for his servant in a way that no human could arrange or control. Think about what this meant for Elijah practically. He couldn't plan his meals. He couldn't store up supplies for tomorrow. He had no control over the menu or the portions. He simply had to trust that when morning came, the ravens would come, and when evening came, they would come again. Every single day, he lived in complete dependence on God's provision. This was Elijah's first lesson in a school that would last for years. He was learning that God could be trusted completely. He was learning that when you obey God's instructions, even when they seem strange or risky, God takes responsibility for the consequences. He was learning that the same God who could shut the sky could also open the mouths of ravens and command them to feed his prophet. The ravine became a sanctuary. While Jezebel's soldiers searched the cities and towns of Israel looking for Elijah, while the queen raged and threatened, the prophet was hidden in a place she would never think to look. He was drinking fresh water from the brook that flowed through the gorge. He was eating bread and meat delivered by birds twice a day. He was spending his time in prayer and communion with God, preparing for what would come next. This season at Chariot was a gift. It was a time of rest and strengthening before the great confrontation that was coming. Elijah wasn't wasting his time in hiding. He was building his faith, deepening his relationship with God, and learning lessons that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. The man who would eventually face down 850 false prophets was being trained in a hidden ravine, fed by ravens, watched over by the God who controls all things. Time passed in the ravine. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The sky remained shut, just as Elijah had declared before King Ahab. No rain fell on Israel. No dew formed on the grass in the morning. The sun beat down day after day without mercy. The fields turned from green to brown to bare dirt. The crops failed completely. The grain supplies in the storehouses began to run low. Animals began to die from lack of water and food. The entire nation was feeling the effects of the drought that God had sent as judgment. And the drought didn't just affect the people who worshipped Baal. It didn't just touch the household of King Ahab or the priests of the false gods. It affected everyone, the faithful and the faithless alike. Judgment on a nation touches all its citizens. The righteous suffer alongside the wicked when God sends his discipline. Elijah watched all of this from his hidden ravine. The ravens still came every morning and evening with food, but something else was changing, something that would directly affect the prophet's survival. The brook at Chariot was fed by rainfall and underground springs. As the drought continued month after month, with no rain to replenish the water sources, the water level in the brook began to drop. What had been a flowing stream became a trickle. What had been a trickle became a series of scattered pools. The rocks that were once covered with water became exposed. The sound of running water grew quieter and quieter. Elijah could see what was coming. He was watching his water supply slowly disappear. And then it happened, as stated simply and directly in 1 Kings 17 verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. The water was gone. The brook that had sustained Elijah for months was now just a dry channel of rocks and sand. Imagine what must have been going through his mind as he watched that last pool of water evaporate. This was his lifeline. The ravens still brought food, but without water, he couldn't survive more than a few days. In the desert heat, without water, a man dies quickly. He could have panicked. He could have questioned why God had brought him to a place that was now failing. After all, hadn't God specifically told him to come to this ravine? Hadn't God promised to provide for him here? Now the brook was dry, and Elijah was facing death from thirst, just like everyone else in Israel. He could have decided to take matters into his own hands. He could have left the ravine immediately to search for water on his own. He could have gone to a nearby town and tried to find a well. He could have headed toward the Jordan River or traveled to a region where there might still be water. Any of these responses would have been understandable from a human perspective. But Elijah had learned something during his time at Chariot. He had learned to wait for God's instructions. He had learned that God's timing is always perfect, even when circumstances look desperate. He had learned that the same God who commanded ravens to bring food could be trusted to provide water when the time was right. The dried brook wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a sign that God had forgotten his prophet or that his protection had failed. It was actually the next step in God's plan. God had a reason for bringing Elijah to Chariot, and now he had a reason for ending that season. The prophet who had declared the drought was experiencing its effects firsthand, but he wasn't abandoned. The moment the water disappeared was the moment God spoke again. Elijah didn't have to figure out what to do next. He didn't have to make plans or devise strategies. He simply had to listen and obey, just as he had done when God first sent him to the ravine. God had already prepared the next place, the next provision, the next chapter of the story. Elijah just had to be willing to move when God said move, and to trust that wherever God sent him next would be exactly the right place to be. God's next instruction was surprising, even shocking. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with a new command, recorded in 1 Kings 17 verses 8 and 9. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Let's understand what God was asking. Zarephath was not in Israel. It was a Phoenician town on the Mediterranean coast, located in the very region where Queen Jezebel had come from. This was Gentile territory, the heartland of Baal worship. God was sending his prophet into what should have been the most dangerous place possible, the homeland of his greatest enemy. And the person who would help him wasn't a wealthy merchant who could afford to feed an extra mouth. It wasn't a powerful official who could offer protection. It wasn't even a faithful Israelite who might have heard of Elijah's reputation. It was a widow, one of the most vulnerable and powerless people in the ancient world. A woman with no husband, which meant no income and no protection. A foreigner who worshipped other gods and had no connection to Israel or its God. This seemed like madness from a human perspective. Elijah was leaving a hidden ravine where God had been miraculously providing for him, and traveling into enemy territory to depend on a poor widow for survival. But Elijah had learned his lesson. When God speaks, you obey. You don't question. You don't hesitate. You simply go. Elijah made the long journey from the ravine in Gilead to the coastal city of Zarephath. When he arrived at the town gate, exhausted and thirsty from his travels, he saw a woman there gathering sticks. Somehow, through divine insight, he knew this was the woman God had prepared. This was the widow who would supply him with food. He called out to her with what seemed like a simple request, as described in verse 10. Would you bring me a little water in a jar, so I may have a drink? It was a reasonable request. In Middle Eastern culture, hospitality was important, and giving water to a thirsty traveler was a basic kindness that anyone would offer. The woman didn't refuse. She turned to go and get him water. There was nothing unusual about this interaction so far. But as she was going to get the water, Elijah called to her again and added something that changed everything. Verse 11 records his second request. And bring me, please, a piece of bread. The woman stopped. She turned back to face him, and what she said next revealed just how desperate her situation had become. Her response is captured in verse 12, and every word carries the weight of hopelessness. As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This was it. This was her last meal. She wasn't exaggerating or making excuses. She was stating a simple, terrible fact. She had just enough flour and oil to make one final piece of bread. She was gathering these sticks to build a fire to bake that bread. She would feed herself and her son one last time, and then they would wait to die from starvation. The drought that Elijah had declared in Israel had spread beyond Israel's borders. It had reached even this coastal Gentile town. Whatever stored food this widow had managed to save was now gone. There was no rain to grow new crops. There was no relief coming. She was out of options, and she knew it. Notice something interesting in how she addressed Elijah. She said, "As surely as the Lord your God lives." She recognized that Elijah served a different God than she did. She was swearing by the God of Israel, though she herself was not an Israelite. Perhaps she had heard stories about this God. Perhaps she had heard that a prophet of Israel had declared this drought. Whatever she knew, she was acknowledging that Elijah's God was real and was watching this conversation. Most people, if they heard what this widow had just said, would have immediately backed off. How could anyone possibly ask for food from someone who was literally preparing to die? It would be cruel, heartless, unthinkable. Any decent person would apologize, say they didn't realize how bad things were, and walk away. But Elijah didn't walk away, and he wasn't being heartless. He was about to offer this dying woman something far more valuable than bread. He was about to offer her a chance to trust in a God she barely knew, a God who could do what seemed impossible. He was about to give her an opportunity to survive when survival seemed finished. But first, she would have to make a choice that would require more courage than anything she had ever done before. Elijah looked at this widow who had just told him she was gathering sticks for her final meal, and he spoke words that must have sounded completely insane. His response is recorded in 1 Kings 17 verses 13 and 14. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. First, make bread for me." Those words must have hit the widow like a physical blow. She had just explained that she had only enough for one last meal for herself and her child. Now this stranger was asking her to use her final resources to feed him first, before she fed her own dying son. But notice what else Elijah said. He didn't just make a demand. He made a promise. He gave her the word of the Lord, a guarantee that if she obeyed, her flour and oil would not run out. The God of Israel, the God she didn't serve, would supernaturally sustain her household until the drought ended. She had to choose in that moment. Would she use her last handful of flour to feed herself and her child, taking care of her own needs as any mother would do? Or would she trust this stranger's promise about a foreign god she had never worshipped? It would have been completely reasonable, completely understandable for her to refuse. She could have said, "I'm sorry, but I have to think of my son first. I can't give away our last food to a stranger based on a promise I have no reason to believe." But something in Elijah's words, some authority or conviction in his voice, some inner witness from God himself, made her believe. Against all logic, against all natural instinct, she chose to trust. Verse 15 tells us what happened next in simple, powerful words. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. She went home. She took her precious handful of flour and her few drops of oil. She mixed them together and made a small loaf of bread. Her hands must have been shaking as she did it, knowing she was using up the last food she had in the world. She baked that bread over the fire she had built with the sticks she had gathered, and then she gave it to Elijah. He ate it. The bread was gone, and now, from a human perspective, she had nothing left. She must have stood there looking at her empty jar, thinking about what she had just done. She had fed a stranger instead of her son. She had trusted a promise from a God she didn't know, and now the moment of truth had come. She reached into the jar, expecting to feel nothing but empty ceramic, but her fingers touched flour. There was flour in the jar, not a full jar, but enough for another meal. She picked up the jug of oil, expecting it to be dry, expecting nothing to pour out. But when she tipped it, oil came out. Not a flood of oil, but enough. She made bread for herself and her son. They ate. They went to bed that night with full stomachs for the first time in who knows how long. And the next morning, when she woke up and checked the jar again, there was still flour. There was still oil. This continued day after day after day. The provision wasn't a one-time miracle. It was a daily miracle that lasted for months, maybe even years. Verse 16 confirms the fulfillment of the promise that Elijah had made. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Think carefully about how this miracle worked. The flour and oil didn't multiply into huge amounts. The widow didn't suddenly find her jar overflowing with flour, and her house filled with jugs of oil. There was never an abundance sitting in storage, never extra to sell or trade or give away. Every day there was just enough for that day's needs, just enough for the three of them, Elijah, the widow, and her son, to have their daily bread. This meant that every single day, the widow had to return to the jar in faith. Every single day, she had to pour from the jug, trusting that something would come out. She couldn't rely on what she had seen yesterday. She had to trust God again today. The miracle was consistent, but it never became automatic or guaranteed. It always required faith. And notice who was being fed by this miracle. Elijah, the prophet of Israel, was surviving in Gentile territory through the faith of a foreign woman. The widow, who had never worshipped the God of Israel, was being sustained by his power. Her son, who had no connection to the covenant people, was eating bread provided by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This miracle was showing that God's care extends beyond Israel, that his power works wherever faith is present, that he responds to anyone who trusts him regardless of their background or nationality. While the rest of the region starved, while crops failed and animals died, while people fought over dwindling food supplies and the strong stole from the weak, this small household in Zarephath had daily bread. They sat down to meals together. They had enough, not abundance, but enough. And every meal was a reminder that the God of Israel was real, that his word through his prophet could be trusted, and that he was able to sustain life even in the middle of drought and famine. The God who had fed Elijah with ravens in a ravine was now feeding him through a widow's faith in a foreign land. And in the process, he was teaching everyone involved that he could be trusted completely, that his resources never run out, and that obedience to his word always leads to provision, even when the path there seems impossible. Life in the widow's house had settled into a pattern. The miraculous provision of flour and oil continued day after day. Elijah had a place to live safe from Jezebel's threats. The widow and her son had food when everyone around them was starving. They had learned to trust in this God of Israel who kept his promises. There was peace in that house, a sense that they were being watched over by someone powerful and good. But then something happened that shattered everything. One day, without warning, the widow's son became sick. It started suddenly and grew worse rapidly. Perhaps it was a fever. Perhaps it was something else. The Bible doesn't give us the medical details. It only tells us that the boy's condition deteriorated quickly and severely. The widow must have been terrified. This was her only child, the only family she had left in the world. She had already faced the prospect of watching him die from starvation. God had rescued them from that fate through the miracle of the flour and oil. She thought those dark days were behind them. Now a different threat had appeared, and this time it wasn't hunger. It was illness. She probably did everything she knew how to do. In the ancient world, mothers knew remedies and treatments passed down through generations. She would have tried every herb, every compress, every method of bringing down a fever or easing pain, but nothing worked. The boy grew worse and worse, and then he stopped breathing. The description in 1 Kings 17 verse 17 is heartbreaking in its simplicity. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally stopped breathing. The boy was dead. Not unconscious, not barely alive, dead. All breath had left his body. The child who had been laughing and playing, who had been eating the miraculous bread, who had been given a second chance at life through God's provision, was now lying still and cold. The widow's only son was gone. All the flour and oil in the world couldn't bring him back. All the miracles they had seen couldn't reverse this. The woman who had shown such remarkable faith, who had trusted a foreign prophet and a foreign God with her last meal, who had seen daily proof of God's power in her home for months, now found herself holding her son's lifeless body. Her grief exploded into accusation. She turned on Elijah with words full of pain, confusion, and anger. Her outburst is recorded in verse 18. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Think about what she was saying. In her culture, people believed that tragedy was divine punishment for wrongdoing. Sickness, death, disaster. These were seen as evidence that someone had offended the gods. She thought that having a holy man, a prophet of God, living in her house had somehow drawn divine attention to her past sins. She believed that God had looked at her life, found her guilty, and taken her son as punishment. This is the cry of a mother whose faith is crumbling under unbearable loss. She had done everything right. She had trusted the prophet's word. She had shared her last meal. She had watched the daily miracles. She had welcomed this man of God into her home. And this was her reward? Her son dead? What kind of God was this? Elijah didn't argue with her. He didn't defend himself or try to explain God's purposes. He didn't give her a theology lesson about suffering or quote promises about God's goodness. He simply acted. His response in verse 19 shows a man who knew exactly what to do. "Give me your son." He took the dead child from her arms. He carried that lifeless body up the stairs to the upper room where he had been staying. He laid the boy on his own bed, and then he did something that reveals the heart of true prayer. What happened next shows us something profound about how God's prophets approach him. Elijah didn't perform some ritual or recite some formula. He didn't have a technique for raising the dead. He simply cried out to God from the depths of his soul. Verses 20 and 21 record his desperate plea. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even to this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." Elijah was questioning God, asking him directly about his purposes. He was pointing out the apparent injustice of what had happened. This woman had shown extraordinary faith. She had saved Elijah's life by sharing her last meal. She had welcomed him into her home, and now her son was dead. It seemed wrong, unfair, cruel. But Elijah didn't stop with questions. He acted in faith. 3 times he stretched himself out on the child's body, placing himself physically in contact with death. 3 times he called out to God, begging him to restore the boy's life. This wasn't magic. This wasn't a technique or a formula. This was a man who believed that the God who created life could reverse death itself, and he was begging him to do exactly that. There was no guarantee God would answer. There was no promise that this would work. Elijah was venturing into territory that no prophet before him had explored. As far as we know from Scripture, no one had ever been raised from the dead before this moment. But Elijah knew his God. He knew that nothing was impossible for the one who controls all things. So he prayed, and he waited, and he believed, and then it happened. Verse 22 records the miracle with simple, stunning words. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Breath came back into the child's lungs. His heart began to beat again. Color returned to his face. His eyes opened. He was alive, not resuscitated, not barely saved, fully alive, brought back from death itself by the power of God, responding to the faith of his prophet. Elijah picked up the living child, carried him down from the upper room, and gave him back to his mother. The words of verse 23 capture the moment with beautiful simplicity. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Imagine that moment. The widow had just accused Elijah of bringing death to her house. Now he was placing her living, breathing son back into her arms. The child she had held lifeless was now warm and alive. The boy she thought she would never see smile again was looking at her. Death had been defeated in her home. Her response reveals that this miracle did more than restore her son. It transformed her faith completely. Verse 24 records her declaration. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Before this, she had trusted Elijah's promise about the flour and oil. She had seen daily miracles of provision, but now she knew with absolute certainty that the God he served was real and powerful beyond anything she had imagined. She had grown up worshipping Baal and the other gods of Phoenicia. She had probably participated in their rituals and believed their promises. But none of those gods could do what she had just witnessed. The God of Israel had not only provided food during famine, he had conquered death itself. He had brought her son back from the grave, and he had done it in response to the prayer of his prophet. This wasn't random chance or natural recovery. This was supernatural intervention, divine power reversing what seemed irreversible. The woman from Zarephath, a Gentile widow who had known nothing about the God of Israel just months before, now knew beyond any shadow of doubt that he was the true God. Her faith, which had begun with one small act of obedience in sharing her last meal, had grown through daily provision and was now sealed with absolute certainty through the resurrection of her son. Elijah had entered this first phase of his ministry by proclaiming a drought to a king. He had been fed by ravens in a desert ravine, showing that God could provide through impossible means. He had multiplied flour and oil in a widow's home, proving that God's resources never run out. And now he had raised the dead, demonstrating that God's power extends even over life and death itself. Every miracle had built on the one before. Every test had prepared him for the next challenge. The prophet who would soon face down 850 false prophets on Mount Carmel was being trained through these experiences. He was learning that the God he served could be trusted absolutely, that nothing was too hard for him, and that his word through his prophet would always prove true. 3 years had passed since Elijah declared the drought. 3 years without rain. 3 years of watching the land die. The famine had become so severe that it threatened the very survival of the nation. What had started as failed crops had grown into a complete catastrophe. Animals were dying by the thousands. People were starving. The economy had collapsed. And still, the sky remained closed. King Ahab was desperate. The situation had become so critical that he was forced to take personal action. In 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 5, we see the king making a decision that revealed just how bad things had become. Ahab had said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals." Think about what this means. The king of Israel was personally going out to search for grass. Not gold, not treasure, not military supplies, just grass to keep his animals alive. This was humiliating work for a monarch. Kings were supposed to sit on thrones and command armies, not wander through dried-up valleys looking for vegetation. But Ahab had no choice. The royal stables were dying. Without horses and mules, there would be no transportation, no military mobility, no way to maintain even the basic functions of government. So the king divided the land into sections with his palace administrator Obadiah. Each of them would search their assigned area, hoping to find anything green that their animals could eat. Now, Obadiah was not like his master. While Ahab had abandoned God to worship Baal, Obadiah had remained faithful to the Lord. Verse 3 tells us something remarkable about this man. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. And verse 4 reveals what he had done during Jezebel's persecution. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. This man who worked in Ahab's palace, who served a wicked king and his murderous queen, had secretly saved 100 prophets from execution. He had found hiding places for them in caves. He had risked his own life to bring them food and water during the famine. He was a hero of faith, working undercover in the heart of enemy territory. So while Ahab searched one part of the land, Obadiah searched another. The king was looking for grass, but Obadiah was about to find something far more significant. As Obadiah was walking along his route, checking springs and valleys for any sign of vegetation, he saw someone approaching in the distance. As the figure got closer, Obadiah's heart must have stopped. He recognized the man immediately. It was Elijah, the prophet who had vanished 3 years ago. The man Queen Jezebel wanted dead more than anyone else in the world. The one who had declared this drought that was destroying the nation. He was standing right there in front of Obadiah. Verse 7 describes Obadiah's reaction. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground, and said, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" He fell on his face before the prophet. This gesture showed deep respect and reverence. Obadiah knew he was standing before a true man of God, someone who spoke with divine authority. But after his initial greeting, fear took over. Elijah gave him a simple instruction in verse 8. "Yes," he replied, "go tell your master, Elijah is here." That command sent Obadiah into a panic. His response, recorded in verses 9 through 14, reveals just how terrified he was of what might happen. He said, "What have I done wrong, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here.' I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here. He will kill me.'" Look at what Obadiah revealed in this desperate speech. Ahab had searched everywhere for Elijah. He had sent messengers to every nation and kingdom in the region. Whenever rulers claimed they hadn't seen the prophet, Ahab made them take an oath to prove it. The king had been obsessed with finding Elijah, probably under pressure from Jezebel, who wanted revenge for the drought and the humiliation it brought to Baal worship. Obadiah's fear was completely rational. He knew how unpredictable prophets could be. God's Spirit might carry Elijah away to some other location after Obadiah reported his presence. Then when Ahab arrived at the meeting place and found no one there, he would assume Obadiah had lied to him, and the penalty for that would be death. Obadiah was also reminding Elijah of his own faithfulness. He was saying, "I'm one of the good guys. I saved 100 prophets while Jezebel was killing them. I've served the Lord all my life. Please don't put me in a position where I'll be executed for trying to help you." But Elijah needed Obadiah to trust him. The time had come for the confrontation that would settle everything. So the prophet made a solemn promise in verse 15. "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." This was an oath. Elijah was swearing by the living God that he would not disappear, that he would be there when Ahab arrived, that Obadiah would not be punished for delivering the message. The palace administrator had to make a choice. Would he trust the prophet's word? He chose to trust. Verse 16 tells us simply, "So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah." The message was delivered. The king was coming, and after 3 years of hiding, after 3 years of miraculous provision in foreign lands, after 3 years of watching Israel suffer under the drought he had declared, Elijah was finally going to face Ahab again. The meeting between the prophet and the king was explosive. When Ahab saw Elijah, his first words were an accusation. Verse 17 records what the king said, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Troubler of Israel. That's what Ahab called him. In the king's mind, Elijah was the problem. This prophet had declared a drought, and the drought had come. Therefore, Elijah was responsible for all the suffering, all the death, all the economic collapse. If only this troublemaker hadn't interfered, everything would be fine. But Elijah wasn't going to accept that accusation. He fired back with the truth in verse 18. "I have not made trouble for Israel." Elijah replied, "But you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." This was the real issue. Israel was suffering not because a prophet had spoken judgment, but because the nation had broken its covenant with God. Ahab and his father Omri before him had led Israel into idolatry. They had replaced the worship of the true God with the worship of false gods. They had murdered God's prophets and promoted the prophets of Baal. The drought was not random punishment. It was the direct consequence of national rebellion against God. Then Elijah issued his challenge. Verses 19 and 20 tell us what he demanded. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. This was bold beyond measure. Elijah was calling for a public showdown. He wanted all Israel to gather as witnesses. He wanted every prophet of Baal present, all 450 of them. He wanted the 400 prophets of Asherah, who were supported by Queen Jezebel's personal funds, and he was going to face them alone. Mount Carmel was the perfect location. This mountain ridge overlooked the Mediterranean Sea and provided a natural amphitheater where thousands of people could gather. It was also traditionally associated with Baal worship. Elijah was challenging the false god on his own territory. Ahab agreed. Whether he thought this would finally prove Baal's power, or whether he simply wanted to see what would happen, we don't know. But he sent messengers throughout the nation, and the people came. The prophets of Baal assembled. The stage was set for the greatest confrontation in Israel's history. When everyone had gathered, Elijah addressed the crowd. His opening words, recorded in verse 21, cut straight to the heart of Israel's problem. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people said nothing. They stood there in silence. They had been trying to worship both gods, hedging their bets, keeping their options open. But Elijah was forcing them to choose. You can't serve two masters. You can't worship the true God and false gods at the same time. The moment had come to decide who was real and who was fake. Then Elijah outlined the test. Verses 22 through 24 describe what he proposed. I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. It was brilliantly simple. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, no human fire. Whichever God sent fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice would prove himself to be the true God. And the people agreed. Verse 24 tells us, Then all the people said, What you say is good. The terms were set. The contest was about to begin, and the odds appeared to be impossibly stacked against Elijah. It was 1 prophet of the Lord against 450 prophets of Baal. But Elijah knew something the crowd didn't understand yet. Numbers don't matter when God is involved. 1 man with God is a majority. Elijah gave the prophets of Baal the first turn. He even let them choose which bull they wanted. They took their animal, prepared it according to ritual requirements, and placed it on their altar. Then they began to call on Baal. Verse 26 describes what happened. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. Morning till noon. For hours they cried out to their God. They shouted his name. They performed their ritual dances. They did everything their religion taught them to do. But nothing happened. The sky remained silent. No fire came. The sacrifice sat there untouched. At noon, Elijah started mocking them. His taunts are recorded in verse 27. Shout louder. He said, "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." This was devastating ridicule. Elijah was suggesting that maybe Baal was distracted, or away on a trip or taking a nap. Maybe if they yelled louder, they could get his attention. The prophet was exposing the absurdity of their religion in front of the entire nation. A real God doesn't need to be awakened. A real God isn't too busy to hear prayers. A real God doesn't go on vacation. The prophets of Baal became frantic. Verse 28 tells us how desperate they became. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. They cut themselves. They wounded their own bodies, thinking that their suffering might move Baal to action. Blood ran down their bodies as they danced and shouted and begged their god to respond. This went on for hours. Verse 29 says, "Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention." Think about what the crowd was witnessing. The prophets of Baal had been at it all day. They had done everything possible. They had shouted, danced, cut themselves, and begged. And they had gotten exactly nothing in return. Baal had not sent fire. He had not sent a spark. He had not sent smoke. There was absolutely no sign that anyone was listening. Now it was Elijah's turn. He called the people to come closer, and they gathered around him. Then he did something that seemed strange. Verse 30 tells us, "He repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down." There had been an altar to the true God on Mount Carmel, but it had been destroyed, probably during Jezebel's persecution. Elijah rebuilt it using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, as described in verses 31 and 32. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Then he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the altar. Everything was prepared, but before he prayed, he did something that seemed to guarantee failure. He had the people drench the sacrifice with water. Verses 33 through 35 describe what happened. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar, and even filled the trench. 4 jars of water, 3 times. 12 jars total. The sacrifice was soaked. The wood was soaked. Water pooled around the altar and filled the trench. There was no way this would burn now, even if someone tried to light it with a torch. It was completely saturated. Remember, this was during a 3-year drought. Water was precious, almost impossible to find. Yet Elijah was pouring it out by the gallon to make his task harder. He was removing any possibility that someone could claim he had used trickery or hidden fire. When God answered, there would be no doubt about what had happened. Then, at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah prayed. His prayer was nothing like the frantic shouting of Baal's prophets. It was calm, direct, and confident. Verses 36 and 37 record his words, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." That was it. One simple prayer. No dancing, no shouting, no cutting himself, no begging. just a straightforward request that God would reveal himself and turn the people's hearts back to him, and God answered. Verse 38 describes what happened next. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Fire came down from heaven, not a little flame that slowly grew. A massive blast of fire that consumed everything instantly. It burned the meat, it burned the wood, it burned the stones of the altar itself, it burned the soil, and it evaporated all the water that had been poured out. In one moment, everything was gone, reduced to ashes by the fire of God. The people's response was immediate and overwhelming. Verse 39 tells us, when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" They fell on their faces. They declared the truth that Elijah had been trying to make them see. The Lord is God, not Baal, not Asherah, not any of the other false gods they had been worshipping. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the one true God, and he had just proven it in front of the entire nation. Elijah thought his ministry had failed, that nothing had changed despite the miracle on Mount Carmel. In his mind, Jezebel's death threat proved all his work was pointless. But his perspective was wrong. God was about to show him the truth. God told Elijah to stand on the mountain because the Lord was about to pass by. Verse 11 describes what happened. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. A massive windstorm hit, so strong it ripped rocks apart. But God was not in the wind. The verse continues. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. The ground shook violently, but God was not in the earthquake. Verse 12 tells us, after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Fire swept across the mountain, but God was not in it, even though Elijah had just seen fire fall from heaven. Then came something different. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. After all the dramatic displays, God spoke in a whisper. His presence came not in power, but in quiet communication. Verse 13 tells us Elijah's response. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. A voice asked the same question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But verse 14 shows Elijah gave the exact same answer. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." He was still stuck in his complaint, still focused on failure, still convinced he was alone. God was teaching him that his work doesn't always happen through dramatic displays. Most of the time, God works quietly in ways that aren't obvious. His voice is often a whisper, not a shout. God didn't argue with Elijah. Instead, he gave him a mission. Verses 15 and 16 contain his instructions. The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet." 3 assignments. First, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. This foreign king would become God's instrument of judgment against Israel. Second, anoint Jehu as king over Israel to replace Ahab's dynasty. Third, anoint Elisha as his successor. Verse 17 explained how they would work together. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. This was God's comprehensive plan spanning years. But God had one more thing to tell Elijah. Verse 18 contained a shocking correction. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. 7,000 faithful people. Elijah thought he was alone, but God had preserved 7,000 who had not worshipped Baal. They were quiet, faithful people, living obedient lives without fanfare. Elijah wasn't alone. His ministry hadn't failed. God was working through thousands, not just one prophet. Elijah left Mount Horeb to find Elisha. Verse 19 describes the scene. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha son of Shaphat. He was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elisha was wealthy. Only rich families owned 12 yoke of oxen, but he worked alongside his servants. Elijah walked up and threw his cloak around him. That gesture said everything. You're called to be a prophet. Elisha understood immediately. He left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Verse 20 records his request. Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, he said, and then I will come with you. Elijah's response tested his commitment. Go back, Elijah replied. What have I done to you? He was saying, make sure this is what you want. Verse 21 shows Elisha's response. So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the ploughing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. Elisha killed his oxen and burned his equipment, his means of making a living. This was irreversible. He gave the meat to the people in a farewell feast, then followed Elijah as his servant. He would spend years learning before becoming a prophet himself. Time passed. King Ahab had a palace in Jezreel, and next to it was a vineyard owned by Naboth. Verse 2 of chapter 21 shows Ahab approaching him. Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or, if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth. Naboth refused in verse 3. The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. According to God's law, family land was permanent inheritance that must stay in the family. Ahab went home sulking. Verse 4 says, he lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. When Jezebel found him, she said in verse 7, Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat, cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, ordering city leaders to hold a fake trial. Verse 10 contains her instructions. Seat 2 scoundrels opposite him, and have them bring charges that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. The elders obeyed. False witnesses accused Naboth. And verse 13 tells us, So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. When Jezebel told Ahab, verse 16 says, When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. God sent Elijah to confront Ahab. Verse 19 contains God's judgment. Say to him, This is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, This is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours. When Ahab saw Elijah in the vineyard, verse 20 shows his guilt. So you have found me, my enemy. Elijah delivered the full prophecy in verses 21 through 24. I am going to bring disaster on you. I will wipe out your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. His entire family would be destroyed. But verse 27 shows something unexpected. When Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. He showed outward repentance. God responded with mercy in verses 28 and 29. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in his day, but I will bring it on his family in the days of his son. The judgment was postponed. Ahab would die, but the complete destruction would come in the next generation. God honored his humility, even though it might not represent genuine heart change. After Ahab died, his son Ahaziah became king of Israel. But Ahaziah was just like his father. He worshipped Baal and rejected the God of Israel. One day, something happened that would test whether he had learned anything from his father's mistakes. Chapter 1, verse 2 of 2 Kings, describes the accident. Now, Ahaziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself. So he sent messengers, saying to them, Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury. The king had fallen through a window or lattice screen in his palace and was badly hurt. Instead of calling on the God of Israel for help, instead of asking a prophet of the Lord what would happen, he sent messengers to consult a foreign god. Baal-zebub was worshipped in Ekron, one of the Philistine cities. The name literally meant Lord of the Flies. This revealed Ahaziah's heart. Even after seeing what happened to his father, even after watching Elijah call down fire from heaven and end the drought, even after all the evidence that the Lord was the true God, Ahaziah still turned to a false god in his moment of crisis. But God was watching. He sent an angel to speak to Elijah, with instructions recorded in verse 3. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? The question cut to the heart of the issue. Israel had the living God, the God who created heaven and earth, the God who had proven his power again and again. Yet the king was acting like Israel had no God at all, running to a foreign idol for answers. Then God gave Elijah a message for the king. Verse 4 contains the prophecy. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. And so Elijah went. This was a death sentence. Ahaziah would not recover from his injury. He would die in his bed because he had rejected the Lord and sought help from a false god. Elijah intercepted the king's messengers on the road and delivered God's message. Then he left. The messengers returned to Ahaziah, and when the king asked why they came back so quickly, verse 6 records their answer. A man came to meet us, they replied, and he said to us, Go back to the king who sent you and tell him, This is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. But the confrontation wasn't over. Elijah gave an order that must have shocked everyone. Verse 40 records his command. Then Elijah commanded them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed that day. This seems harsh to modern readers, but we have to understand the context. These men had led Israel into idolatry. They had promoted the worship of false gods. They had supported a system that demanded child sacrifice and temple prostitution. They had deceived the people and led them away from the true God. Under the law of Moses, the penalty for leading Israel into false worship was death. Elijah was enforcing God's law. The false prophets were gone. Baal had been publicly humiliated. The people had declared their allegiance to the Lord. The battle was won. After the execution of Baal's prophets, Elijah turned to Ahab with a simple instruction recorded in verse 41. "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." There was no rain yet. The sky was still clear, but Elijah could hear it coming, not with his physical ears, but with the ears of faith. God had promised rain, and God keeps his promises. The drought was about to end. Ahab went to eat and drink, but Elijah had something more important to do. Verse 42 tells us, "So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees." This was the posture of intense prayer. Elijah wasn't celebrating his victory. He wasn't basking in the glory of the fire from heaven or the people's declaration of faith. He was praying for the rain that God had promised to send. Even though God had promised it, Elijah still had to pray for it. Prayer is the means by which God's promises become reality on earth. Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea. The servant went, looked, and came back with his report in verse 43. "There is nothing there," he said. "No clouds, no signs of rain." The sky was as clear and blue as it had been for 3 years. But Elijah didn't give up. He told his servant, "Go back 7 times. 6 times the servant went and looked. 6 times he came back with the same report. Nothing. But on the 7th time, something changed. Verse 44 records what the servant saw. The 7th time the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." A tiny cloud, just a speck on the horizon, no bigger than a human hand. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. But to Elijah, it was everything. That small cloud was the beginning of the answer to his prayer. That tiny sign was the first evidence that the drought was about to break. Elijah immediately sent his servant to Ahab with an urgent message. "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Then things happened fast. Verse 45 describes the transformation. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The tiny cloud grew, the sky darkened, wind began to blow, and then the rain came, not a drizzle but a heavy downpour. After 3 years of drought, the sky finally opened. Water poured down on the parched land. The famine was over. But something else happened that showed just how powerfully God's Spirit was moving through his prophet. Verse 46 tells us, "The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel." Jezreel was about 17 miles from Mount Carmel. Ahab was riding in a chariot pulled by horses, the fastest mode of transportation available. But Elijah ran on foot and got there first. This wasn't natural human speed. This was supernatural strength given by the Spirit of God. The prophet who had called down fire from heaven now ran faster than horses, arriving at the city gates before the king's chariot. The day that had started with a confrontation between one prophet and 450 false prophets ended with fire from heaven, the execution of the false prophets, the breaking of the drought, and a prophet supernaturally outrunning a chariot. It was the greatest display of God's power Israel had seen in generations. Everything had changed. Ahab returned to Jezreel and told his wife everything that had happened. He told her about the contest on Mount Carmel, about the fire from heaven, about the people's response, and about what happened to her prophets. Verse 1 of chapter 19 summarizes his report. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. You would think Jezebel might be afraid. You would think that seeing Baal's complete failure and the Lord's overwhelming power might make her reconsider her position. But Jezebel didn't fear God. She feared nothing, and she was absolutely furious. Her response was swift and deadly. Verse 2 records what she did. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." This was a death threat backed by an oath. Jezebel was swearing by her gods that within 24 hours, Elijah would be dead just like her prophets. She was declaring war on the man who had humiliated her religion and killed her prophets. And everyone knew that Jezebel kept her promises. Think about the position Elijah was in at this moment. He had just experienced the greatest triumph of his life. He had stood alone against 450 false prophets and won. He had seen fire fall from heaven. He had watched an entire nation declare their allegiance to the true God. He had ended a 3-year drought. He had run 17 miles with supernatural speed. He was at the absolute peak of spiritual victory. And then one woman's death threat completely destroyed him. Verse 3 tells us what happened. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. He ran. The prophet who had stood fearlessly before King Ahab, who had mocked 450 prophets, who had commanded the execution of false prophets, was now running in terror from one woman. He fled south, leaving Israel entirely and entering the kingdom of Judah. He went all the way to Beersheba, the southernmost city in Judah, as far from Jezebel as he could get. When he reached Beersheba, he left his servant behind and went alone into the wilderness. This detail is important. He was isolating himself, cutting himself off from human contact, giving in to despair. Verse 4 describes what he did next. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." This was complete emotional collapse. Elijah was suicidal. He was begging God to let him die. The man who had just raised someone from the dead was now asking for his own death. He felt like a failure, like all his efforts had been pointless. He said he was no better than his ancestors, meaning he felt he had accomplished nothing, changed nothing, made no difference at all. This is what happens when we come down from the mountaintop of spiritual victory. Elijah had experienced something amazing, but he was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and spiritually depleted. And when Jezebel's threat came, he had nothing left to fight with. Fear overwhelmed him, and he ran. He sat under that broom bush in the desert, waiting to die. Verse 5 tells us, "Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep." He was done, finished. He had given up completely. The greatest prophet in Israel was lying in the wilderness, hoping he wouldn't wake up. Everything he had fought for, everything he had risked, everything God had done through him, none of it seemed to matter anymore in the face of one queen's hatred. But God wasn't done with Elijah, not even close. The prophet thought his story was over, but it was actually just beginning a new chapter. God had plans for this broken, exhausted, terrified man lying in the desert, and those plans would take Elijah to places he never imagined, teach him lessons he desperately needed to learn, and prepare him for a ministry that would extend beyond his own lifetime. While Elijah slept under the broom bush, exhausted and wanting to die, an angel touched him twice and brought food and water. Strengthened by that food, verse 8 tells us he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb was another name for Mount Sinai, where God had given Moses the law. This was where God had spoken to Israel in thunder and lightning, where he had made his covenant with the nation. Elijah was going back to the beginning, back to where God first revealed himself to his people. When he arrived, Elijah found a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him with a simple question recorded in verse 9. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God knew exactly why Elijah was there. This question was designed to make the prophet think about his actions. Why had he run from Israel? Why had he abandoned his mission? Why was he hiding instead of standing in faith? Elijah poured out his heart in verse 10. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." He was defending himself. He had worked hard, taken risks, stood alone. And what had it accomplished? The people had rejected God. His altars were destroyed. His prophets were dead. Elijah felt he was the last faithful person left, and they wanted him dead too. Ahaziah wanted to know who this man was. He asked them to describe him. Verse 8 tells us what they said. They replied, "He had a garment of hair and had a leather belt around his waist." The king said, "That was Elijah the Tishbite." The king recognized Elijah from the description immediately, and instead of fearing God's judgment or repenting like his father had briefly done, Ahaziah decided to capture the prophet. Verse 9 describes what he did. Then he sent to Elijah a captain with his company of 50 men. The captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on the top of a hill, and said to him, "Man of God," the king says, "come down." 50 armed soldiers climbed the hill where Elijah was sitting. Their captain ordered the prophet to come down and appear before the king. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. He responded with words recorded in verse 10. Elijah answered the captain, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. Fire came down instantly. All 51 men, the captain and his entire company, were killed by fire from heaven. This was the same power Elijah had demonstrated on Mount Carmel, but now it was being used as judgment against those who tried to arrest God's prophet. You would think this would make Ahaziah stop and reconsider, but the king was stubborn. Verse 11 tells us, "At this the king sent to Elijah another captain with his 50 men. The captain said to him, 'Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once.' A second captain with 50 more soldiers climbed the hill. This captain was more demanding, ordering Elijah to come down immediately. But the result was the same. Verse 12 says, "If I am a man of God," Elijah replied, "may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then the fire of God fell from heaven and consumed him and his 50 men. another 102 men dead. Fire from heaven had struck twice. Yet the king still didn't understand what he was dealing with. He was fighting against God himself, and that's a battle no one can win. Amazingly, Ahaziah sent a third captain with 50 more men. But this captain was different. He had seen what happened to the first two groups, and he was terrified. Verse 13 describes his approach. So the king sent a third captain with his 50 men. This third captain went up and fell on his knees before Elijah. "Man of God," he begged, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants." This man came in humility and fear. He fell on his knees and begged for mercy. He acknowledged that Elijah was a man of God and pleaded for the lives of his men. He wasn't there to arrest the prophet. He was there to survive. Verse 14 continues his plea. "See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first two captains and all their men. But now have respect for my life." He recognized what he was facing. He knew that fire from heaven had already killed 102 soldiers. He wasn't going to repeat their mistake of approaching Elijah with arrogance or demands. The angel of the Lord then spoke to Elijah with instructions in verse 15. The angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So Elijah got up and went down with him to the king. God told Elijah it was safe to go. The third captain's humility had saved his life and the lives of his men. Elijah went with them to face Ahaziah. When he stood before the king, Elijah delivered the same message God had given him on the road. Verse 16 records his words. He told the king, "This is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Because you have done this, you will never leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." The prophecy was repeated directly to the king's face. Ahaziah would die because he had rejected the Lord and sought help from a false god. There was no escape, no way to change the outcome. The judgment was final, and it happened exactly as Elijah said. Verse 17 tells us, "So he died according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken." Ahaziah died without an heir, so his brother Jehoram became king in his place. The son of Ahab and Jezebel learned nothing from his father's life, and he paid for it with his own. God's word through his prophet proved true once again. The time had come for Elijah to leave this world. God was about to take him to heaven, and somehow both Elijah and Elisha knew this day had arrived. Chapter 2 verse 1 sets the scene. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. They started walking from Gilgal. As they traveled, Elijah said something to his servant recorded in verse 2. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Elijah tried to leave Elisha behind, but Elisha refused. He swore an oath that he would not leave his master. They continued together to Bethel, where a group of prophets came out to meet them. Verse 3 tells us what these prophets said. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "so be quiet." Everyone knew what was about to happen. The prophets at Bethel knew, Elisha knew, and they wanted Elisha to acknowledge it, but he told them to be quiet. He didn't want to talk about losing his master. Then Elijah tried again to leave Elisha behind, Verse 4 says, "Then Elijah said to him, 'Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho.' And he replied, 'As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you.' So they went to Jericho. The same thing happened at Jericho. The prophets there asked Elisha the same question in verse 5, and he gave the same answer. 'Yes, I know, so be quiet.' A third time, Elijah tried to go alone. Verse 6 records, "Then Elijah said to him, 'Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan.' And he replied, 'As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you.' So the two of them walked on. Why was Elijah trying to leave Elisha behind? Perhaps he wanted to spare his servant the pain of watching him leave. Perhaps he was testing Elisha's commitment one last time. Whatever the reason, Elisha refused to abandon his master on this final day. They arrived at the Jordan River. 50 prophets from Jericho followed at a distance to watch what would happen. Then Elijah did something that echoed what Moses had done centuries before. Verse 8 describes the miracle. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. The Jordan River parted, just like the Red Sea had parted for Moses. Elijah and Elisha walked across on dry ground, while 50 prophets watched from the other side. This was a sign that the same God who had been with Moses was with Elijah, and the same power was being passed to Elisha. Once they had crossed the Jordan, Elijah turned to his servant with an offer. Verse 9 records his words. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. A double portion was what a firstborn son received as his inheritance, twice what the other children got. Elisha wasn't asking to be twice as powerful as Elijah. He was asking to be recognized as Elijah's true successor, the one who would carry on his ministry. He wanted the spiritual inheritance that would allow him to continue the work. Elijah's response in verse 10 shows this was a difficult request. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." Elijah couldn't grant this request himself. Only God could give Elisha what he was asking for. But Elijah gave him a sign. If Elisha was able to see what happened when God took Elijah away, then he would receive the double portion. If not, he wouldn't. This meant Elisha had to stay alert. He had to keep watching. He couldn't look away or get distracted. His spiritual inheritance depended on being able to witness what God was about to do. They continued walking and talking together. Verse 11 describes what happened next. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Suddenly, without warning, heaven opened. A chariot made of fire appeared, pulled by horses of fire. These weren't natural animals or vehicles. This was a supernatural manifestation of God's glory and power. The chariot came between Elijah and Elisha, separating them. And then Elijah was taken up. He didn't die. He didn't get sick and pass away peacefully. He was caught up by a whirlwind into heaven while he was still alive. His body and spirit went together into God's presence, bypassing death entirely. Elisha watched the whole thing happen. Verse 12 tells us his reaction. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. Elisha called Elijah his father, not his biological father, but his spiritual father, his mentor, his teacher. He cried out that Elijah was worth more than all the chariots and horsemen of Israel's army. One prophet was more valuable for the nation's defense than all its military power, because the prophet had God's presence and power with him. Then Elisha tore his clothes in grief. His master was gone. The man who had trained him, taught him, and walked with him for years had been taken to heaven. Elisha was alone now, responsible for carrying on the ministry by himself. But he wasn't really alone. Something had fallen from heaven during Elijah's ascension. Verse 13 tells us, Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Elijah's cloak, the same cloak that had been thrown over Elisha years ago to call him into ministry, the same cloak that had parted the Jordan River just minutes before, had fallen back to earth. This was the sign of succession, the passing of authority from one prophet to the next. Elisha picked it up and walked back to the Jordan River. Now came the test. Would the same power that had worked through Elijah work through Elisha? Verse 14 describes what happened. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The water parted again, the same miracle that Elijah had performed with his cloak. Elisha now performed. This proved that God's Spirit had indeed passed to him, that he was the legitimate successor, that the ministry would continue. The 50 prophets who had been watching from the other side saw what happened. Verse 15 records their response. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. They recognized what had happened. They acknowledged Elisha as the new prophet, the one who now carried Elijah's authority and power. They bowed before him in respect, accepting his leadership. Elijah's story had ended in the most extraordinary way possible. He never tasted death. He was taken directly into God's presence, one of only 2 people in all of Scripture to leave earth this way. His ministry had started with declaring a drought and had ended with a chariot of fire. From beginning to end, his life demonstrated that the God of Israel was real, powerful, and faithful to his word. If this story impacted you, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next biblical documentary. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about God's power and faithfulness, and let us know in the comments which part of Elijah's story touched your heart the most. See you in the next video.